They died for their hymns. That is not a metaphor. Inside the hallowed sanctuary of Glastonbury Abbey, one of the holiest sites in all of Christendom, the air, thick with the scent of incense and melting wax, was suddenly torn apart by the screams of dying men. Arrows fletched for the battlefield, whistled past the great crucifix, thudding into ancient wooden choir stalls. Norman soldiers' men, arms in mail and leather, stormed the church, their swords drawn not against some invading pagan horde, but against the unarmed monks who lived there. Monks in their black robes slipped and fell in their own blood on the sacred altar steps. Their prayers and chants were drowned out by the clang of steel and the guttural shouts of killers. What sin? What heresy? What unforgivable crime could have led to this? What could turn a house of God into a slaughterhouse? The answer is almost unbelievable. They were fighting over music. The new Norman abbot, a man named Thurston, despised the traditional Gregorian chants the Anglo-Saxon monks had sung for generations. He demanded they adopt a new foreign style of chanting from Fotcamp in Normandy. The monks refused. Their hymns were their heritage, their connection to God, their very identity. And for that, their abbot ordered his soldiers to kill them. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, a contemporary record of the event, tells us with chilling simplicity. The monks were in the chapter house, and the abbot's men burst in and fell upon them, and they slew some of them, and some they wounded, so that the blood came from the altar, down upon the steps, and from the steps to the floor. This single, horrifying event rips back the veil of serene piety. We imagine covers the medieval monastery. It reveals a world not of gentle contemplation, but of brutal power, fierce pride, and shocking violence. We picture these men as humble servants of God, copying manuscripts in silent scriptoriums and tending their gardens in quiet prayer. The reality was something else entirely. Monasteries were not just places of worship. They were colossal corporations. They were political powerhouses, fortresses, and private kingdoms, ruled by abbots who were often more like feudal warlords than spiritual fathers. And within these stone walls, every human drama, every temptation, and every sin was amplified, creating a pressure cooker of piety and perversion that would eventually explode. This is the story of what was hidden behind the cloister door, a story of piety, yes, but also of debauchery, of forbidden lusts, murderous plots, and a darkness that festered in the very heart of the sacred. To understand this world, you must first understand one crucial thing: money. Before there could be sin, there had to be power. And in the Middle Ages, power came from land and wealth, and the monasteries were drowning in it. Pious kings and nobles, terrified for the fate of their immortal souls, would donate vast tracts of land to monasteries in exchange for prayers. A charter might read, "I, Lord Ethald, for the salvation of my soul and the souls of my ancestors, do grant the lands of Blackwood and the village of Oakervan to the Abbey of St. Cuthbert, to be held in perpetuity." In perpetuity, forever. Unlike a family estate, which could be divided among heirs or lost through a bad marriage, monastic land was never broken up. It only grew. They were exempt from most taxes. They collected tithes, a 10% tax on all agricultural produce, from everyone living on their massive estates. They ran mills, breweries, and fisheries. They were masters of sheep farming, their wool trade a cornerstone of the national economy. An abbot of a major house like St. Albans or Cluny was a prince of the church, wielding more economic and political power than most secular barons. He sat in the king's council, commanded knights, and lived in a state of luxury that would have shocked the desert fathers they claimed to emulate. And with that much power and that much money, corruption was not a risk, it was an inevitability. Take the case of William of Wallingford, abbot of St. Albans in the late 15th century. To the outside world, he was the venerable head of one of England's most prestigious and ancient abbeys. But behind the scenes, a storm was brewing. The abbey was sinking into debt, its buildings falling into disrepair. Yet the abbot himself seemed to want for nothing. Whispers turned into accusations, and eventually the Archbishop of Canterbury, John Morton, launched an official investigation. The report he compiled is one of the most damning indictments of monastic corruption ever written. Wallingford was accused of simony, the sin of selling church offices. He had allegedly sold off positions within the abbey, treating sacred duties as mere commodities. He was accused of perjury, of lying under a holy oath. He was accused of rampant embezzlement, of funneling the abbey's vast income into his own pockets, spending it on luxuries and personal projects, while the community starved and the sacred buildings crumbled. But the most shocking accusation was far more personal. The Archbishop's report stated with cold fury that Abbot Wallingford had a mistress, not just a secret dalliance, but a woman he had installed in a nearby manor house, living openly as his concubine. And worse, he had stolen precious jewels and golden chalices directly from the abbey's treasury. Items donated by kings and queens over centuries, and gifted them to her. But the rot didn't stop at the abbot's door. The investigation uncovered a cancer that had spread throughout the community. The report goes on to describe a nearby nunnery, the Priory of St. Mary de Piazot, which was under the abbey's control. The prioress, the report claimed, had turned the holy house into little more than a brothel for Wallingford and his senior monks. The nuns, sworn to be brides of Christ, were instead treated as a private harem for the very men who were supposed to be their spiritual guardians. The Archbishop wrote of the frequent access of the abbot and his monks, not to say the more wanton of them, to the said priory, by day and by night, as to a common brothel. Imagine the betrayal. Young women sent to these priories by their families, believing they were dedicating their lives to God, only to be preyed upon by the most powerful men in their world. This wasn't an isolated case. It was a pattern. The sheer isolation and immense, unchecked power of an abbot created the perfect conditions for tyranny and self-indulgence. The walls designed to keep the world out also served to hide the sins within. And the sins of the flesh were, by far, the most common and the most desperately hidden secret of monastic life. The rule of Saint Benedict, the very foundation of Western monasticism, was unequivocal. Monks were to be celibate. They were to renounce all worldly pleasures, to sublimate the desires of the body in favor of the purity of the soul. It was a beautiful, soaring ideal. It was also, for many, a psychological impossibility. For every truly devout soul who found peace in chastity, there were countless others for whom the monastery was a prison of frustrated desire. We know this because, just like in the case of St. Albans, the church itself kept records. They are called episcopal visitation records. Periodically, a bishop or his archdeacon would tour the monasteries in his diocese to check on their spiritual health. They would interview each monk privately, asking about the discipline of the house, the conduct of the abbot, and, most revealingly, the sins of his brothers. These documents, never intended for public view, are a raw, unfiltered glimpse into the secret life of the cloister. Let's look at the records from the Diocese of Norwich in the 15th century. At the Priory of Wymondham, one monk, Brother John Blakeney, is accused of being a common night walker. He habitually climbed the walls after dark to visit the local village. For what purpose? The records are explicit. For the sake of finding women. At the same priory, another monk was accused of keeping a suspected woman in his private chambers for 3 weeks. How was this possible? Many senior monks had their own rooms, sometimes even small apartments within the monastic complex, complete with a private fireplace and space for a servant. It was a short step from privacy to secrecy. The problem was so widespread that bishops' reports are filled with monotonous, almost weary, sounding injunctions against it. The brethren are to have any dealings with women, either within the monastery or without. The back gate leading to the fields is to be kept locked at all times. No woman, of whatever age or status, shall be permitted to enter the cloister, the dormitory, or the refectory. The very fact these rules had to be constantly repeated proves how often they were broken. At the monastery of Walsingham, a hugely popular pilgrimage site, the monks were accused of using the constant flow of female pilgrims as a dating pool. The bishop's report from 1514 accuses the canons of luring women, including married women, into the priory under the guise of religious services, only to seduce them. One canon, Thomas Pass, was accused of having a regular affair with the wife of a local innkeeper. Another, Nicholas Wymondham, was named as the father of her child. And this brings us to the most tragic consequence of these forbidden affairs: the children. What happened to a child fathered by a monk or born to a nun? In most cases, they became invisible. They might be quietly fostered out to a family in a nearby village, their true parentage a carefully guarded secret. Sometimes a wealthy abbot might even provide for his illegitimate children, setting them up in a trade or arranging a good marriage, the hypocrisy seemingly lost on him. But there is a darker, more gruesome side to this. All across Europe, archaeological digs at the sites of former monasteries and nunneries have uncovered the tiny skeletons of newborn infants, buried secretly in unconsecrated ground in walls or under floorboards. At Littlemore Priory near Oxford, the 1517 visitation by the Bishop of Lincoln uncovered a scandal that shocked even the hardened authorities. The prioress, Catherine Goldstone, was found to have given birth to a child fathered by a local priest. Worse still, she had coerced one of the younger nuns, encouraging her to run away from the priory to pursue a life of sin. When the bishop investigated further, he found the priory was in a state of moral collapse. The nuns had pawned the convent's silver to buy fashionable clothes, and the prioress had stolen the convent's timber to build a fine chamber for herself and her illegitimate daughter. The discovery of infant skeletons, like those found at a medieval hospital cemetery in York, which included a disproportionate number of newborns, points to the desperate measures some women took to conceal their shame. Infanticide was the ultimate in a mortal sin that promised damnation. But for a nun who had broken her sacred vow, it might have seemed like the only way to escape a lifetime of disgrace. The pressure to maintain a facade of perfect purity was so intense that it could drive people to the most horrific acts. And it wasn't just heterosexual desire that haunted the cloisters. In an all-male environment where men lived, worked, and slept in close proximity, same-sex attraction was an undeniable reality. This terrified the church authorities. The 11th century theologian Peter Damian wrote a blistering treatise on the subject, which he called the Liber Gomorrhianus, or the Book of Gomorrah. He railed against what he called the sin against nature, describing it as a plague sweeping through the clergy and the monasteries. He listed in graphic detail various acts he considered sodomy, and prescribed horrifyingly severe penances, ranging from years of fasting on bread and water to public floggings and permanent expulsion from the church. While Damian's book is a polemic, filled with fire and brimstone, the sheer panic in his writing reveals that he was responding to a very real phenomenon. Visitation records are more circumspect, often using euphemisms like the unspeakable sin or the crime of Sodom. But the accusations are there. Monks are accused of sharing a bed, of showing inordinate affection for one another, of forming exclusive partnerships that undermined the communal life of the monastery. These men, who had joined a monastery seeking salvation, or perhaps just a stable life, found themselves trapped. Their natural human desires, for companionship, for intimacy, for love, were branded as demonic temptations. They were told their very nature was a gateway to hell. But what if I told you the greatest sin wasn't lust or greed? What if the system itself was designed to create monsters? The very piety they professed, the rigid rules they followed, could twist a man's soul into something unrecognizable. And sometimes the most pious were the most dangerous. Forget the abbot with his mistress or the monk sneaking out at night. That is simple, understandable human weakness. The truly terrifying stories from the monasteries are not about sex. They are about power control and a psychological violence that could curdle faith into fanaticism. The monastery was a closed society. Once you took your vows, you were there for life. You were subject to the absolute authority of the abbot. He was your father, your judge, and your jailer. For a benevolent and wise abbot, this system could create a community of profound spiritual peace. But for a cruel, paranoid, or ambitious abbot, it could create a living hell. And when the pressure became too much, the monks themselves could snap. Consider the chilling events at Eynsham Abbey in 1228. The abbot, a man named Adam, was a stern disciplinarian. Perhaps too stern. One morning he was found dead in his bed. At first it seemed a tragedy, perhaps a sudden illness, but there was a rope tied around his neck, and a beam overhead looked suspiciously damaged. The monks claimed their beloved abbot, in a fit of spiritual despair, had taken his own life. Suicide was a mortal sin, damning a soul to an eternity in hell, and bringing unimaginable shame upon the monastery. But the truth, as it slowly emerged, was far worse. An investigation revealed that Abbot Adam had not committed suicide. He had been murdered, and the killer was one of his own monks. A monk, who remains nameless in the records, had strangled the abbot in his sleep. He then, with the help of a few co-conspirators from among the brethren, staged the scene to look like a hanging. They hoped the story of a suicidal abbot, however shameful, was better than the truth, that their holy sanctuary had become the scene of a cold-blooded assassination. The simmering resentment, the daily humiliations, the feeling of being trapped with no escape, had boiled over into brutal violence. This wasn't an isolated incident. Chronicles are dotted with stories of rebellions of monks, rising up against a tyrannical abbot, sometimes deposing him, sometimes driving him out. The struggle for power within these supposedly peaceful communities could be as vicious as any court intrigue. And if a monk couldn't kill or expel his abbot, what other recourse did he have? None. The monastery had its own system of justice, and it was swift and brutal. Every large abbey had its own prison. This wasn't just a cell to hold a monk for a few days of reflection. Monastic prisons could be lightless subterranean dungeons, places of unimaginable horror. A monk found guilty of a serious crime, heresy, conspiracy, or repeated, unrepentant sin, could be sentenced to years of solitary confinement, chained to a wall, fed only bread and water. The ultimate punishment, reserved for the most heinous offences, was a sentence known as in pace. In pace. In peace. The name is a cruel joke. A monk sentenced to this was, for all intents and purposes, to be buried alive. He would be sealed into a small windowless cell, often built directly into the thick stone walls of the monastery. A small opening might be left through which a meagre ration of food and water could be passed. And there he would remain, in total darkness and silence until he died. He was to be forgotten by the world, his name struck from the records, his existence erased. It was a living tomb, a man-made hell designed by men of God. While some historians debate how frequently this sentence was carried out, the existence of these prison cells is undeniable. They have been found in the ruins of abbeys across Europe. They are a silent, terrifying testament to the absolute power wielded by abbots, and the extreme lengths to which a monastic community would go to enforce its iron discipline. The psychological toll of this life is hard for us to comprehend. Imagine the constant surveillance, the public confession of minor faults in the chapter house, the fear of the abbot's wrath, the dread of the monastic prison. Add to this the physical hardship, the freezing cold of unheated churches in winter, the monotonous diet, the sleep deprivation caused by rising for prayers in the middle of the night. This environment could break a man, or it could twist him into something else. It could lead to a kind of religious madness, where the lines between divine ecstasy and demonic possession became terrifyingly blurred. Monks and nuns, their bodies weakened by fasting, and their minds saturated with stories of saints and demons, were prone to visions. Some of these were beatific, visions of the Virgin Mary, or of angels promising salvation, but many were horrifying. The 12th century monk, Gibbert of Nogent, wrote in his autobiography about the terrors that haunted his monastery. He speaks of demons appearing in the dormitory at night, sometimes taking the form of monstrous beasts, other times appearing as beautiful women to tempt the sleeping monks. He describes a fellow monk who became convinced a demon was living inside him, causing him to blaspheme and desecrate holy objects. Was this genuine demonic possession, or was it the manifestation of severe psychological distress? A mind cracking under the strain of enforced piety and repressed humanity. We see this even more starkly in the lives of female mystics. Women like Christina the Astonishing, a 12th century Belgian nun, exhibited behaviors that today would see them institutionalized. After a near-death experience, she claimed to be so repulsed by the smell of human sin that she would climb trees, hide in ovens, or throw herself into freezing rivers to escape it. She would roll in fire or stand on one leg for hours on end as a form of penance. At the time, her community viewed her as a living saint, her bizarre and self-destructive behavior interpreted as a sign of extreme holiness. Today, we might see it as a tragic cry for help from a woman suffering from profound trauma. This is the disturbing paradox at the heart of the medieval monastery. The very pursuit of spiritual perfection could lead to a complete psychological breakdown. The desire to purge the self of all sin could result in self-harm and madness. The institution designed to save souls could, in some cases, utterly destroy them. The monastery was a place of extreme contradictions. It was a library and a prison, a sanctuary and a battlefield, a place of sublime art and sordid sin. Here, a monk could spend 50 years patiently illuminating a single manuscript, creating a work of breathtaking beauty for the glory of God. And in the next cell, his brother monk might be secretly plotting to murder their abbot. In the scriptorium, a scholar could translate the works of Aristotle, preserving the knowledge of the ancient world. And in the dormitory above, a young novice could be tormented by night terrors, convinced that succubi was stealing his vital essence as he slept. In the abbey church, the glorious sound of polyphonic chant could rise to the heavens, a sound so perfect it was thought to be a taste of paradise itself. And just outside, in a shallow, unmarked grave, lay the body of an infant, the secret shame of a nun who had broken her vows. So we return to our question, piety or debauchery. The truth is, you cannot have one without the other. They are two sides of the same tarnished, golden coin. The medieval monastery was not a failure of the religious ideal. It was a testament to the terrible, wonderful, and intractable complexity of being human. It was an experiment, on a grand scale, to see if humanity could be perfected, if our base instincts could be prayed and fasted and disciplined away. The experiment failed, but in its failure, it tells us more about ourselves, about the enduring conflict between our aspirations and our appetites, than any sanitized story of saintly perfection ever could. The stones of these ruined abbeys, standing silent in the rain, don't just tell a story of prayer and psalms. They are monuments to a forgotten war. A war fought not on battlefields with swords and shields, but within the silent cloisters and the tortured souls of the men and women who called them home. They sought heaven, but sometimes in their desperate, flawed, and all too human struggle, they created a hell of their own making.